Hi, Year Sevens. Today I'm just going to run you through the basic plot structure that you could expect to see in any narrative. Now, I'm going to use the example of The Incredibles to talk to you about how plot structure works and how that forms throughout a text. I want you to think about Dougie as I go through these different points. So we're studying Dougie this term, obviously. You guys have all read the book already, but now I'm going to challenge you to see if you can identify the plot structure points within Dougie using these examples and these definitions. So first of all, your plot structure is the story that is told in any novel, any play, or any movie. The plot structure generally has 6 components. Now, I can't say that every single narrative or every single story follows this structure, but most do. So the first point is the exposition. The second is conflict. The third is the rising action. And the fourth is the climax. The fifth is then the falling action, and the sixth is the resolution. So I will give you a definition of each of these points, and I'm also going to give you an example to illustrate how this would actually work if we were to apply it to a movie or to a book. So the first point is the exposition. Now, the exposition is just a fancy way of saying introduction. It's the introduction of the story. In it, it contains the setting, it introduces the main characters to the reader, and it gives background information on the story as well. It is the information that is needed to understand the story. So I've got an example for you here. I've used the example of The Incredibles. So in the movie The Incredibles, we meet the Incredible family. The beginning of the movie explains what Mr. and Mrs. Incredible used to be like back when they were superheroes. The movie then jumps forward in time to when Mr. Incredible is no longer a superhero. He works at an office, and Mrs. Incredible stays home to look after their 3 kids. Now, without this information, we would not be able to understand the story that then unfolds about the Incredible family. I hope you guys have seen The Incredibles. I chose it because I think most people have. If not, I highly recommend. So the next point that I'm going to talk to you about is the conflict. Once we know who the characters are, we know what the story is, the characters are often presented with a conflict. So the conflict is the portion of the story where a problem or an issue is presented within the context of the story. The problem or issue in some way affects the main character and sometimes other characters as well. So if we're going to look at The Incredibles again, in the movie The Incredibles, Mr. Incredible feels worthless because he can't use his superpowers. He feels that he's wasting his talent and is bored in his normal life. This is the conflict that he experiences, which leads him to pay less attention to his family and more attention to a new superhero mission that he's been given. So a conflict doesn't have to be necessarily a physical conflict. It doesn't have to be a fight or a challenge or something like that. Sometimes it can be an emotion as well. So if we're looking at The Incredibles, Mr. Incredible, the conflict that he feels in his story is that he's frustrated at his job, he's frustrated at his life, he's frustrated that he can't be a superhero anymore. So next up, we have the rising action of the story. So the rising action is the portion of the story where a character tries to solve the conflict. This is often the longest part of a story. Now, remember, plot points aren't very clear cut. They're not going to necessarily scream at you, I'm the rising action, I'm the conflict, I'm the falling action. It doesn't happen like that. So you do have to do a little bit of analysis to see if you can find these points. Now, the rising action is often the longest part of the story because it takes the character a while to solve this conflict that they've been faced with. So, for example, Mr. Incredible tries to make himself feel good again by throwing himself into his superhero work. This takes up the majority of the film. The rising action will often be a long section of story where lots of little things happen in between. So, for instance, while Mr. Incredible is applying himself to his superhero work, he's neglecting his family, and Mrs. Incredible feels hurt because she thinks Mr. Incredible doesn't love her anymore. And Violet and Dash have their own problems at school. So you can see that even though the rising action, I'm identifying it as Mr. Incredible trying to solve his conflict with himself, trying to solve the problem that he has, that he feels like he's not worthy, he feels like he's not being himself. He feels bored. He tries to solve that by throwing himself into his superhero work, but also neglecting his family at the same time. So lots of little things can happen within the rising action. But if we're focusing on a character's attempt to solve conflict, then we would identify the rising action as Mr. Incredible trying to solve his problem, trying to feel worthy again by throwing himself into his superhero work. So next up, we have the climax. So the climax is the tensest moment in the story. It's the hardest moment for our main character. It's the turning point in the story that occurs when characters try to resolve a complication. So it's a turning point in the story. Something happens that halts the rising action. So for example, the climax in The Incredibles is when Mr. Incredible finally figures out that Syndrome has been tricking him this whole time. He realizes that he neglected his family, whom he loves. It's often hard for the main character to face the climax of a story, and it can often come in the form of a challenging situation. So next up, of course, we have our falling action. Sometimes it's easy to think of it like this. The rising action goes up, the climax is at the top, and then the falling action comes back down again. So the falling action is where the characters begin to apply a solution to the conflict and tie up loose ends in the story. So for example, once Mr. Incredible realizes Syndrome is evil, he and his family work to stop Syndrome from destroying the city. Mr. Incredible's solution to the problem is to use his superpowers and his family's in order to protect the city. So this was the falling action in The Incredibles. Once they realized Syndrome was evil, once Mr. Incredible realized that he wasn't doing the right thing by paying attention to his family, then he decided to try to solve that solve that problem by pulling together and working as a family to defeat Syndrome and save the city. So in this instance, this is the falling action. It is the solution that's applied to the conflict that actually works. And lastly, we have our resolution. So the resolution is how everything turns out in the story. It's the set of events that brings the story to a close. So for example, once Syndrome is defeated, Mr. Incredible goes back to his life with his family, and he's happy with what he has. He realizes how lucky he is, but he also realizes that being super is a part of his identity, and he shouldn't be ashamed of it. His family attends Dash's school sports race, and they're all happy together. Now, you often find with Pixar movies and Disney movies that the resolution is a happy resolution for our characters. Not all stories are like that. Some stories don't have happy endings, but that doesn't mean that it's not still following the same plot points. It just means that it's a negative resolution rather than a positive resolution. So what I'd like you to do now, guys, now that you've heard these points, and please go back and re-watch if you are unsure about exposition or about climax or about rising action, please go back and watch again. That's why these videos are so helpful. But I'd like you to try to apply this understanding of plot structure to Dougie. So I want you to see in Dougie, can you identify the section where it tells us what the exposition of the story is? So remember, the exposition is the introduction to the story, the information we need to know in order for the story to make sense to us. So I want you to try to identify the exposition, try to identify the conflict that Dougie faces, the rising action of the story, the climax of the story, the falling action, and then the resolution as well. Okay, so hopefully this video helps you, and remember, you can always email for help if you need. I would really encourage you to talk to your parents, older siblings, or guardians if you are running into any issues at all.